from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
We are very pleased to bring you a 2-week series on whitewater rafting, and also we'll be talking about hiking and walking. We are very fortunate to have as our guest an internationally experienced individual and company that is very, very involved with whitewater rafting, which is a very exciting activity, and I know many of you who watch this program are outdoors persons who will certainly enjoy what we're about to bring you. In addition to our interview with our guest, we have some wonderful footage to take you on those rivers via television for this exciting discussion. I welcome to the program Mr. Peter Grubb, who is the president of River Odysseys West Incorporated, which is located here in Idaho. Peter, I have seen that footage, and I know that you not only raft the major rivers of the state of Idaho, but as we get into this, we're going to talk about other places in the world that you're involved with this rafting. And thank you for taking time to be with us for this 2-week series. And we have a lot of questions we want to ask about what you do.
All right. Well, thank you, Tony. Good to be here.
And as always, I'm so pleased to have our 2 regular panelists to join with me in questioning our guests on this interesting subject. First of all is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney and a law clerk for a district judge in the state of Idaho. And next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And I shall ask Janelle to commence the questioning.
Well, Peter, it's such a pleasure to have you on the program today, and this is going to be very adventuresome. What exactly is River Odysseys West? What is your company?
Well, our roots are in whitewater rafting, and in a broad sense of the term, what we are is an adventure travel company. Our specialty and what remains a major portion of our business is actually outfitting whitewater rafting trips here in the state of Idaho on a number of different rivers.
And what kinds of things do you include in white river rafting? What was the definition of that term?
The term is used to describe river trips where the water is white, meaning they're not canoe trips, they're not trips that are scenic float trips. They're trips for people that are looking for a little excitement, maybe a little adrenaline rush. And there's quite a range within the definition of whitewater from class 2, 3, which would be easy to intermediate type whitewater, to class 5, which is more extreme, to class 6, which is basically unrunnable.
That means you're going to get some rapids, is that right? Probably.
Right.
And you're going to get some fast water as compared to slow water.
Yeah, rivers have different characteristics, and some are steep rivers, what we call the gradient is how we measure them. And a steep river would be a river that drops maybe 30 feet per mile, and you would have a lot of white water, but you would also have maybe fast-moving smooth water in between the rapids. Other rivers may have a lower gradient. Locally here, the Spokane River, for example, drops about 15 feet per mile. The Snake about 14 feet per mile, meaning you have a rapid and then a calm area where the river may be very calm and very still, but it's the old calm before the storm. The next rapid is in effect creating a dam, which is why the river is slow. And when the water spills over that dam through the rocks, that's where the whitewater excitement is.
Now, I take it that you're going to provide a guide to get us that don't know how to raft the river through those rapids or through those danger spots. Is that correct?
Right. Our trips are designed for people with no previous experience for the most part. We have some trips where we recommend that people have been rafting before, but we, in either case, always have a guide in the raft with our guests, and we have anywhere from 4 to 6 guests per raft. And we also offer people varying levels of participation. They can sit in an oar boat, which is a raft about 17 feet long usually, where a guide sits in the middle and rows using oars, and people need to simply hang on and take pictures. And the more active people will enjoy paddle rafts, and in the footage you'll see later, you'll see both kinds of rafts. In the paddle raft, people are sitting on the edge and actually paddling and participating in the trip. Those tend to be smaller rafts, more exciting. There's nothing to hang on to, so people tend to fall out of those more frequently.
And I take it the river changes from day to day too, and perhaps even within one day it can change.
To an extent, although More likely it's from week to week as snow melt drops, rivers drop. There are some rivers that we run, though, that are very sensitive to either rain or hot weather and will jump up visibly a foot or two overnight even.
Steve Sheen.
Peter, tell us a little bit about how you got into the whitewater rafting business.
Well, my background was had been being a lifeguard and swim teacher, and I was during college looking for a summer job at a summer camp. I thought that would be fun, and I was looking through a book and I saw an ad for whitewater guides wanted in West Virginia, and I was going to school in Maryland at the time, and I got on a map to figure out where West Virginia was, and applied and ended up being hired by this company who was looking for people that didn't know anything, because then you arrived with no prejudices. And this company in West Virginia then taught me how to be a river guide, and I worked for them for a full season doing one-day trips. I did 111 one-day trips my first year, and I enjoyed it, but what I didn't enjoy was that I would meet people in the morning, have fun all day long, and say goodbye at 5 o'clock. And I thought it would be much more rewarding to work longer trips, 5- and 6-day trips, where you would get to know people and where there would be more than just the whitewater, more elements of nature activity. And I heard that the Grand Canyon and Idaho were the two places to look for work. And so I spent the winter applying for jobs in both places and came to Idaho in 1979 to work for a company on the Salmon River, and have been here ever since.
Is there a requirement in Idaho that you be licensed in any way to guide people on the kinds of trips that you take?
There is, and in fact Idaho is the most stringent state in terms of requirements for guides and outfitters. And guides are licensed not only by river but by actual section of river, and there's certain requirements, and to a degree they're somewhat minimal, and I would say that in our own training program our guides far exceed any sort of state requirement. But yes, there is a licensing.
Is the licensing process, does that apply to your company or to you and each of the guides that works for you individually?
Both. Row Inc. as a company has a license. I have a license as the managing agent, and I have a license as a guide, and then each one of my guides has a license, and we each pay an annual fee for that license.
Well, that reminds me of something I intended to ask anyway. You described yourself as an adventure travel company. Are you also a travel agent? Do you book people's transportation out here, or are you strictly involved in selling the trips once they're here?
Mostly the latter. We do some air travel arrangements on our international trips, but in terms of domestically, no. And we're not, typically a travel agent is simply somebody who represents the service and sells that service, and we are the actual provider of the service, and hence the term outfitter.
Antonio, let me get in one
Sure.
last question. As a founding director of the Greater Coeur d'Alene Convention and Visitor Bureau, I'm always interested in tourism and travel. Who do you work with to book your trips if you don't do most of that yourself? And where do your clients, your customers, come from for the most part?
We book about 80% of our trips directly. In other words, straight to the consumer or the traveling public, and we do that through our own brochure and mailings. The other 20% comes from travel agents and also tour operators, which are people who, for example, might bring a group of 20 Europeans over to visit the national parks and incorporate 3 days of rafting as part of that larger tour. Our guests come from all over the country. The Pacific Northwest is certainly a big market for us, as is California, and the East Coast would be a strong third. And then it's just sort of spattered over here and there.
Among your international clientele, is there a particular place where they generally come from?
Well, mostly Central Europe, England, and France, and Germany. And that's, at this point in time, a very small part of our business.
I have with me one of your schedules, Peter, and I noticed that at least this schedule for 1995, it's very heavy from May up into August, or maybe early September. Is that the season mostly that you, or do you go to other parts of the world and do this the year round?
Our big season is May 1st to September 15th in terms of rafting in Idaho. And the biggest part of that season is probably July 1st to August 20th. That's the time of year where we never have enough guides and boats. And of course, one of our challenges is to spread out the demand into those shoulder seasons. We also operate trips in Turkey during that same time frame. And then in the winter months, we go to Ecuador and run a rafting trip on the headwaters of the Amazon. And that takes place from December to March. So our company has gradually evolved into more of a year-round business from being strictly seasonal.
I want to have you to identify some of the rivers that you do. Most all the great rivers of Idaho, and then I see on here Ecuador rainforest rafting that you just mentioned. And I see Mediterranean yachting adventures and the French Canal cruising. I was very correct to talk about you in relation to international experience, but identify some of those rivers for us and tell us a little bit about why some may be more challenging or a bit more interest to people than others, depending on what their experience is.
All right. From north to south is probably the easiest way to do that.
Sure.
Starting up by the Canadian border, we run the Moyer River, which is a one-day trip, strictly springtime. The main focus is the whitewater. It's a trip that's great for beginners and at the same time is quite challenging. It's a fairly steep river, and because it's spring, it's cold water. So it's not a type of trip where you jump out of the boats and swim. When it runs out of water, we move to the St. Joe, which runs a little bit longer and is a similar type of trip, one day, quite exciting, beautiful North Idaho, cedar forest, harlequin ducks, moose, that kind of thing. And then our one-day operation in North Idaho moves to the Clark Fork, which is in Montana, just outside of Missoula, through the Alberton Gorge. That river is in quite a large drainage, so we run it all summer long. And the reason we don't start any sooner is that the Moyer and the St. Joe are more exciting in earlier season. Then moving further south, we do the Locksaw, which is the most difficult whitewater trip that we do, and in my mind, the most difficult trip in Idaho that's run by rafting companies. It's a class 4 river, steep gradient. We wear helmets, wetsuit booties. It's for people that have been rafting before and are looking for the next notch in excitement. It's mostly a 1- and 2-day trip. Further south, we run the Salmon River, which is, in a sense, the antithesis of the Locksaw. It's a little bit lazier, warm water, summertime trip where between the rapids you can jump out and swim. We camp on big beaches, and those tend to be multiple day trips, 3, 4, 5, and even 6-day trips. We take a lot of families on that river, especially with children in the 5 to 12-year age range, and we run family-focused trips there. Further upstream on the Salmon, we run the Middle Fork, starting around Stanley, Idaho, in the Sawtooth Mountains, and it flows north, and that's a 6-day trip through the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, which is the biggest wilderness in the lower 48. And the entire Salmon River is the longest undammed river that's contained in any single state in the lower 48, so it's a pretty spectacular resource to have. Going to the west, we run the Snake in Hell's Canyon on the Idaho-Oregon border. Again, a 3 to 6 day trip, big whitewater, rather famous, great fishing. And then in the extreme south of Idaho, we run the Owyhee River, which is again a spring runoff trip, May, early June, desert scenery like you'd expect to find in Utah, very steep canyons, spring wildflowers, hot springs, wonderful trip, but very unpredictable. Not one you can plan on more than 3 or 4 months out because we never know until we see what sort of snowpack we get.
Mm-hmm. How does any one of those or all of those rivers compare with your rafting in Ecuador, for example?
The trip that we do in Ecuador would be closest to the Snake River in terms of the volume of water and the style of whitewater. We talk about volume of rivers in terms of cubic feet per second. And again, a small river might have 700-800 cubic feet per second. The Spokane River at flood stage in this area runs 30,000 cubic feet per second. The Snake River might run as high as 80 or 90,000 cubic feet per second. Most of the time it's between 10 and 20,000, as is the river that we run in Ecuador. So it's big volume water, meaning that it's not very technical. There aren't a lot of rocks we have to miss, but there's big waves and big holes and hydraulics that are of concern. It's a river where we take bigger rafts, and it's, of course, scenically entirely different than anything we do in Idaho. It's rainforest. We're in the headwaters of the Amazon basin, about 3,000 feet above sea levels. It's warm, a little bit muggy. The plant life, bird life, everything is completely different.
On our second show, this is my teaser for next week, we're going to talk with our viewers about some of the difficulties and techniques on the water and what they would do. But I'm going to ask the staff, I think they're ready to go here. We're going to, on this show about 4 minutes of some of your whitewater rafting trips, and we'll come back next week and we'll also show footage too. But at this time, I'd ask our staff to show Peter Grubb and his company on a whitewater rafting of several rivers in Idaho. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know you found that extremely exciting, and some of those rapids were very, very challenging. And Janelle, that's a wonderful lead-in for you to continue.
Yes, it is. That is an adventure. But I know that also, in addition to the adventure, there are lessons to be learned when you go whitewater rafting. Can you tell us what you think are some of the things that people come away from a trip feeling good about?
Well, primarily they're themselves. I think when you are in nature and you get away from the hecticness and the pressures and the stresses of daily life, and you have a chance for some quiet and soothingness of the river and the canyon, you get a little more connected with yourself and feel better about that. In terms of what people learn, I think that varies, of course, for each person. It can be anything from stronger relationships with family members or loved ones they might have come with, to a much better understanding of rivers and public lands policy in the West, the consequences of building dams. For example, when we float down the Snake River, we run by places where there are no beaches left because all the sediment has been settled out behind the dam, and places that once had an acre of sand beach are simply rock now. It's a consequence of dam building people would go away with. We as guides try to set the tone for leaving only footprints along the way, and we do that through a variety of measures, using fire pans to contain the ashes so that when we leave the beach the next morning there's no sign that we had a fire, taking all of our garbage with us, composting everything, recycling everything. And for a lot of people that is not a way of life, so they may go home with a new idea that, gee, yeah, we should be cutting the cans out, our tin cans apart and recycling those and making that effort. So there's a myriad of things. We take people to see pioneer homesteads, we take them to see Indian rock art, and we tell them about life in the canyon, and that gives people a whole different sense of what this country was like in past times and what it was like to have been a pioneer, or what it was like to have lived here 5,000 years ago and hunt with a stone arrow. So I think there's unlimited possibilities for learning and enrichment.
I would think that'd be very impressive. But I have an additional question now. What about people like myself who have perhaps not been on a float trip? Is it safe? And so I'm going to give you a little opportunity to respond to what some people may have seen on the video when they were looking at what looked like some pretty exciting things going on. So what do you provide people with, and how do you train your guides so that it will be a safe trip?
Well, every trip begins with a very thorough safety talk once we reach the put-in, which takes about anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes depending on the water level and the river we're on and the dangers that are present. There's no question that rafting has a risk, and that's one reason people do it. It's fun to be challenged, it's fun to have the adrenaline rush of taking a risk, but it's a calculated risk. And what we are as guides are two things. We're logistics managers and we're risk managers. And what we try to do is push the threshold of excitement to the extent that we can safely. It would be very bad for business if it wasn't safe. We wouldn't get too many return guests. And that's true industry-wide, statistically, nationally. If you look at the numbers, numbers of hundreds of thousands of Americans that go rafting every year, there's very few accidents on professionally guided river trips. We wear life jackets at all times when we're on the water. And the combination of wearing life jackets, having good equipment, having guides that know the river, and having given the safety talk so that when the above three things don't all mesh and a raft still flips or somebody falls out, each person is prepared in terms of knowing what they should do to minimize the risk becoming, or the danger they're in becoming life-threatening. Those things all add up to making rafting a relatively safe activity.
And so you take people of all age groups?
We do. The youngest we've taken is my own kids, who have both been on 5-day trips at 6 months of age. we won't take other people's kids that young, but we take 5-year-olds quite routinely, and we've had numbers of people in their early 80s on our trips. So our trips are designed within certain parameters for anybody to join, and people, for many people, they've never been camping before, and we make that easier by setting up tents and bringing along a lot of things that make camping more comfortable. Little roll-up tables, in other words, tables that are flat but that will roll up and stow in our rafts during the day, comfortable sleeping pads. We do all the cooking, wash all the dishes. We call it safari-style camping, and it's as close to that as you can find in this country. So it's very comfortable, and it allows a lot of people that would never venture out of or away from asphalt to get into the wilderness and see some remarkable country in a comfortable and safe manner.
Steve Sheen.
I've got to give you an opportunity to retell the story. You briefly told me before the show about how you found Turkey as a new site for your rafting company.
Well, the story actually goes back to 1974 when I was traveling in Turkey as a teenager with a French family, and the war over Cyprus broke out between Greece and Turkey, and we had to leave, and we were on our way to Troy, and I, naturally, having had some mythology education, was very interested in Troy. In college, I actually studied the classics and had quite a keen interest in Greek and Roman civilization and mythology. And when my wife and I were getting married, we were thinking about a place to go for a honeymoon. This was in 1984. And I said, well, let's go to Turkey. I've seen you can do these yachting trips there. We should go and scope that out. And the more we got to thinking about how much that was going to cost, I decided, well, heck, let's just put it in our brochure and see if anybody will sign up. And so we did as much research as we could ahead of time. We put it in the brochure. And at that time, the company was quite small. We had led all the trips, so everybody that had been with Roe knew my wife and I. And we got 8 people who had been rafting with us to sign up to go to Turkey with us under the understanding that it was the first time exploratory trip. And so in September off we set with 8 people in tow on our honeymoon. But we also then spent another month just by ourselves in Greece and Turkey.
I've got one other quick question I've got to ask. I know there are a lot of people out there who are going, wow, is this a great job or what? But I'm also mindful, as an avid golfer, of the conversations I've had with golf pros who get to play 2 or 3 times a year because business won't let them enjoy the game. Is it a business for you or is it a great job?
Well, it's both. I don't like to whine. It's a demanding job. I don't think there's very many people that can do this job. You have to have a high tolerance for risk-taking. I mean, on any given day, we might have 100 people on different rivers whose lives literally are in our hands. There's tremendous numbers of logistics and vehicles to keep operating and that kind of thing. There's the marketing challenges. During the summer, we have 28 guides working for us, so there's all the personalities and problems of being an employer of employees. Mm-hmm. So as the company has grown, so have the headaches and the challenges. At the same time, I'm a believer that we all control and get involved in things to the extent that we want to, and those have been my choices, so I can't really complain.
Peter, on that note, I have to bring the program to conclusion. I have a signal that we're out of time, but on behalf of the panel and the staff, we thank you so much for being here. And the good news for our viewers is that you'll be back next week when we'll do part 2 of whitewater rafting with you as the president of River Odysseys West Incorporated, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Ladies and gentlemen, I would invite you to be with us when we will continue this subject next week. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. From the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to our second show on the subject of whitewater rafting. For you viewers who were not with us last week, we did part 1, and we're concluding with that today. And it was a very exciting program last week, and we have other questions to ask about how this all takes place and on what rivers that our guest does whitewater rafting and the level of difficulty. We welcome back to the program Peter Grubb, who is the president of River Odysseys West Incorporated, and he has a company that does the major rivers of Idaho and certainly other places in the world like Ecuador. He is internationally experienced with this exciting activity, and I also want to inform you in a few minutes we'll be showing some videotape of that action, and it's very, very active. Peter, welcome back to the program. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Tony. Pleasure to be here again.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have regular panelist Janelle Burke, who is a law clerk and an attorney in the state of Idaho, and I shall ask Janelle to commence the questioning.
Peter, it was very exciting to talk with you last week about River Odysseys West, which is ROW, which is row. And we talked a little bit about the fact that your company is an adventure travel company and that you specialize in whitewater rafting. But can you tell me, let's say I'm a person who wants to select a trip now, and I need to know something about what kinds of trips do you offer? What kinds of trips might I be able to take with your company?
Well, quite a large variety of trips would be possible. And were you to call me on the phone and ask me that question, I would probably turn the questioning around and ask, well, what are you looking for? What sorts of scenery would you like to see? How much excitement would you like to have? Are you coming alone? Or are you going to bring your family? Are you going to bring the grandparents or the kids? To try to fit your needs and desires with the sorts of trips that we offer.
So let's talk about a one-day trip. If I was going to be prepared for a one-day trip, what kinds of things would I need to do? I need to select the place I'm going to go first, of course. But after that, what kinds of things do I need to do to prepare for that one-day trip?
Really not much. Part of the selection process would be determining how much excitement you wanted. And if, for example, you were to choose a one-day trip on the Lochs, our most difficult river, we would want to make sure that you were in good physical shape and that you had had some rafting experience before. And if you're in good physical shape, then probably you're not going to do anything special for that trip. If you were calling and saying, this is my first time, I'm a little bit nervous, where can I start? I might
Let's
recommend.
do that one.
All right. Then I would probably recommend, for example, the Clark Fork River, which is just a couple hours east of Coeur d'Alene, actually in Montana. It's a warm water river. The rapids are intermediate, and between the rapids there's long, lazy stretches of flat water where people can jump out and swim. And again, there's really not much you would have to do in terms of preparing. We send you a list of what you need to bring, and that would include a swimsuit, tennis shoes, sunscreen, sun hat, and rain gear, because here in the Rocky Mountains you never know what kind of weather you're going to get. And whatever you might not have in terms of any sort of specialized gear like rain gear or synthetic materials for warmth, we also rent on location at the river. So the whole idea behind our trips is that you don't need any special preparation, and you don't really need to go out and spend a lot of money for additional gear. That's what you pay us for.
And what kind of gear do you supply then for us? You supply, of course, the raft, and so what kinds of things do you supply?
Well, we provide the rafts and paddles and life jackets, and then all kinds of related safety gear that might not ever come into play, things that are called throw bags, which are lines we can throw to people that are swimming too far from the raft, first aid kits, pumps to pump up boats, repair kits if a raft were to get a hole in it, that kind of thing. In terms of what you're going to see on the river, the rafts, of course, and the guides, the local transportation, you meet us at a point where you park your car, get into our bus, we drive to the put-in, and at the end of the day we take you back to your car. And then on a one-day trip we also provide lunch, and that would be primarily it.
And so, and if you were going to go on a more difficult trip, then you would provide such things as helmets, I take it, as well.
Right. On a river like the Lochs, we also provide helmets, which, interestingly enough, are not so much to protect you from falling out of the raft, but in relatively violent whitewater, rafts will buckle and people get thrown around, and people tend to bang heads and bang paddles into heads, and that's what the helmets primarily are useful for. But also, on a river like the Lochs, where the water's quite cold and hypothermia is a concern, we provide wetsuits and wetsuit booties to reduce the risk of hypothermia.
Back to a more general river, the Clark Fork perhaps, what kinds of clothing should I wear when I come? Generally on a rafting trip.
Well,
now, not talking about middle of the summer, real warm days, but let's talk about a little bit more cool days.
If it's a cool day, we would recommend synthetic, always synthetics, never cotton. Things like polypropylene underwear, which doubles as great ski gear in the winter, or what's referred to as nylon fleece, commonly sold under brand names like Patagonia or whatnot. the reason behind those materials is that they don't absorb water, and what little water they do absorb quickly dries. Over the top of that's an ideal thing on sort of a cool, cloudy day where maybe it's not raining much, but you're getting splashed from the river. If you add onto that a lot of white water, or you're sitting in the front of the raft and or it's raining, you would then add some sort of an impermeable shell over that, raincoat, which can be anything from a simple yellow slicker to a specialized whitewater raincoat with a neoprene gasket around your neck and neoprene cuffs for your hands.
Would you kind of take us again from north to south and talk about the level of difficulty of the rivers? It's in some fashion.
All right. In the north, we run the Moyer River, which is up, actually comes out of Canada from the Purcell Mountains and flows into the Kootenay, just about 15 miles below the border. And that's a Class 3 intermediate whitewater trip, spring runoff, cold water. We provide wetsuits, great beginner's trip, and at the same time quite exciting. Steep river, always something going on. No lazy stretches, no swimming, that kind of thing. The St. Joe would be the next river to the south, and it's similar to the Moyer. Maybe not quite as steep and doesn't have quite as much white water, but quite similar. And then to the east is the Clark Fork, which we talked about earlier, as another intermediate trip. Moving south, the Lochsaw, which comes from the Selway Bitterroot Mountains on the Idaho-Montana border and flows primarily west, is very fast-flowing, difficult Class 4 whitewater. At times the Lochsaw gets too high and we can't run a certain 10-mile stretch of it. It's just simply too dangerous. At that point the water has become Class 5, and if a raft were to overturn, it's so fast-flowing we would have a hard time getting everybody back. And people would have a hard time getting themselves to shore even. It's that fast.
And for benefit of our viewers, the lower the number, the less difficult the trip. The higher the number, Class 6 being you're not able to do that. Is that correct?
Virtually unrunnable, right. Class 1 is fast-moving current with no obstacles. Class 3, moderate obstacles, difficulty. Has to do with the technical difficulty. So yes, Class 5 is basically the limit that anybody runs, either on their own or even with a guide.
Now I interrupted you.
Well, proceeding from the Lochsaw, just immediately over the mountains to the south and primarily west would be the lower section of the Salmon River, which is an intermediate, again, intermediate river with warm water, gets up to 70 degrees in the summer. And water temperature has a lot to do with difficulty. A warm water river is more suitable for people that are more subject to hypothermia, such as little children and older folks. And so that's a trip where we, for example, encourage multi-generational trips where you may have grandma and grandpa who are 75, mom and dad who are 45, and the kids who are 5 to 12 years old. Perfect for that. Fun whitewater, big beaches to camp on. Just over the mountains to the west from the Salmon is the Snake in Hell's Canyon, which is also basically an intermediate, but it's quite impressive in that it's a large volume river, so you get big waves, big holes, which translates into big roller coaster rides, lots of punch in the rapids. Further east and south is the Middle Fork of the Salmon, which is a seasonal river to some extent with snowpack, and primarily intermediate Class 3, a little bit of Class 4, but completely different than the Snake River in the sense that it's much smaller. There's lots of rocks to miss. You don't get so much big roller coaster rides, but you get lots of exciting, let's move the raft to the left, move the raft to the right type of rides. And people that are in our smaller paddle rafts where everybody's paddling have to have a pretty teamwork attitude to maneuver through that. And then further south is the Owyhee River, which we actually run 3 different sections, and they vary from quite easy Class 2 on up to a very difficult section of river that has some rapids that we simply don't run. We actually carry our rafts around.
Now, if a person was interested in going on a raft trip, what is one of the things they should do? They should contact you, of course, but how do they do that? Do they write to you generally or call, and then they make arrangements, you send them information, and they pick the trip that would fit them? Is that the way that
basically
the
first step of the process is usually over the phone. We do a lot of advertising, and we have an 800 number So generally speaking, our first contact is over the phone, and we'll ask people a few questions and then send them our general brochure, and if we've determined that a particular river would be the most suitable choice, we'll also send out at that point some details on that particular trip. But for many people, it's just send me the 20-page brochure, they get it home, they study it. We have lots of information in there in terms of what length of trips, what ages they're suitable for, how difficult they are. Then they'll call us again and say, well, I've read your brochure, but I'm confused. Should I do the Moyet or do the Lochsa? And then we'll ask them questions and try to narrow down their choice and ultimately recommend a trip for them.
We'll let you give that 800 number if you like, because if there are viewers who, we always like to make things accessible to our viewers when they're interested in doing something. So if you'd like to give them that 800 number, you can do so.
All right, sure. Well, it's 800-451-6034.
Okay. I want to follow up on what Janelle's talking about. Yes, I've looked at some footage that we're going to show again in a minute. Certainly the difficulty varies, as you've indicated, by these classifications, but with the different types of river and different flow of the water and difficulty, do you change rafts? I know that some rafts are a lot larger than others and some are smaller. I saw on some of your trips there was a canoe, and obviously in some parts of the rivers that couldn't happen. How do you determine that, or the size or number of people can go depending on the difficulty?
Well, first of all, on our 1- and 2-day trips, we strictly offer paddle rafts, which are the rafts where everybody's paddling, because for the most part, people going on 1- and 2-day trips want the excitement. And then, as far as your question about the size of the raft, it really depends on the size of the river and the volume of the water. On the Lochsa, for example, early in the season when it's running a big volume of water, we'll run about a 16-foot raft, and we have a guide in the back who has oars, and we have paddlers in the front. And that's sort of the dynamite combination for power and maneuverability. And being 16 feet long, the raft is quite stable, and it's less likely to turn over than a smaller one would be. Now, as the water drops on the Lochsa, as the snow melts and we get into later June, we move into about a 13-foot long raft, which is more maneuverable. There's, at lower water, more rocks to miss. The passages are a little bit narrower, so we need that smaller raft, and it makes the trip more exciting because it is smaller. So each river, on the Lochsa, we actually have 2 fleets of rafts for varying conditions. The Moyet is always, even though it has a lot of high and low water differences, we can pretty much stick with one size of raft. On our longer trips, the 4-, 5-, and 6-day trips, we have the added element of needing to carry food and tents and camping gear for 6 days. And so we also then have larger boats, 17, 18 feet long, that are oar-powered, where a guide sits in the middle and rows and sits on a huge cooler that carries ice and food. And we have built special boxes for carrying breads and all the other food. And in the back of the boat, there's typically a deck that's suspended where we put the camping gear.
Okay. Well, this is a great time to take a break, and we're going to show about 4 minutes of the footage on different rivers. We've edited this together, and then we'll come back and we'll talk more about just what you were discussing about difficulty. At this time, we'll ask our staff to show this footage with Peter Grubb and whitewater rafting. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know that you agree with me that there was a lot of action there, and this certainly is the kind of sports for those who like very challenging activity. Peter, just a couple more questions in relation to the tape that we have just seen. I saw, in addition to the rafts and all, an individual that was in a much smaller craft. I know there was kayaking and canoeing and so forth. But for even water of that type of challenge, you'd certainly need to be a very professional to do that. That would not be for the first timer.
Well, what we saw in that footage were two things. There were hardshell kayaks, and we use those on the Lochsaw and some other rivers when the water's quite high as an additional safety measure. If somebody were to fall out of a raft and get a little too far away, that kayak, being very maneuverable, can come to their assistance. But you also saw what we call inflatable kayaks in some of that film, which are suitable for people that have no experience. And we use sort of a follow the leader type system when we take those on our trips. We give people basic instruction on how to use the boat. It's not like a hard shell kayak in the sense that you can turn it upside down and roll with the famous Eskimo roll. These boats, when they turn upside down, you fall out. And so they're suitable. And on rivers like the lower part of the Salmon, we run a lot of those. People love them because it's just that much more exciting. And it's one of the things that, for example, when you've got mom, dad, and the kid along on the trip, and everybody's seeking for a different level of excitement, the mom and dad may take turns in the inflatable kayak, where if it's a 7-year-old kid, he's a little too young for that. He'll stay in one of the larger boats, but it allows everybody's goals for excitement to be met.
This might be a difficult question because I know you enjoy it all, but for someone who's a professional like yourself, is there a particular type of river or water that you think is more fun than others? I know you've talked about today that there are rivers where there's no still or eddy water. You're constantly in action. Others where it's building up because of the eddy water. Do you have a preference in the type of river?
Well, in my younger days, I was more of an adrenaline seeker, and I would have said that I enjoy the demanding whitewater the most. The rivers that are constantly challenging and pushing the limits and skills. At this point in my life, I'm very happy on an intermediate river, and what to me makes a great river is a river that has a lot of elements, and I think of the whitewater as merely punctuating the experience, but a river that also has elements of culture, whether that be Native American culture and pioneer history, and also elements of nature study and nice camping conditions. Those are the things that now attract me most to a river.
May I assume that also if you're on a river where there's almost constant action, just like what you said about yourself, that's more for the person who may be younger and certain physical conditions, because you're in action more than if you have rest periods in between?
To a degree, although we get plenty of people in their 50s and 60s on the Lochsaw, which as long as people are in good shape, that's fine. I think almost a more important distinction there is the length of trip. People that go on 1 and 2 day trips tend to be people that are doing it more for the excitement of the whitewater. People that are more interested in the entire experience will go on the longer trips. In our business, which has been around now 16 years, we find very little crossover of people that go on 1 and 2 day trips to those same people. Maybe 10% of them will eventually go on a longer trip. People that are going to go for 5 days will right off the bat sign up for a 5-day trip.
I see. One final question before we go to Janelle. Obviously there's some risk, and you talked about that in the show last week. What is some of the most dangerous conditions that could even endanger one's life? What must you watch out for, both as a professional yourself and for those that you are responsible for on a trip?
Well, the most dangerous conditions are high water. And when you combine high water with cold weather, then you've got the most dangerous situation. And that's what you always read about in the spring every year, people getting out on water that's over their heads. It's almost always high water and cold. And so all of our defenses are up, so to speak, on those kinds of trips. And one of the reasons high water is dangerous is A, things are happening much more quickly. Rivers tend to rise, and rivers that are lined by forests, like the Moye in particular, the river then is over its banks and running through the trees, and there's just no recovery time or place.
Both logs and rocks and all.
Right, and if it gets high enough, you start having logs that are torn out of the bank running down the river with you. And for example, on the Moye, we don't run trips if it's over 6.5 feet on the gauge. And without getting into the details of how the gauge works, the point is that there's just a maximum point at which we feel that it is no longer safe to be on the river. And no matter how good you are, it's not worth the risk.
I should add a footnote that you've never lost anyone on any of your trips. Everyone's returned safe. And I'm sure that's because of the kind of safeties that you're concerned about. Janelle?
Well, one of the things that we saw a lot of in the clips were, of course, very exciting whitewater rafting. But I know that in a trip you can also do other kinds of things. So would you tell us a little bit about what some of the other activities are that may be very meaningful to people who want to take a trip?
Mm-hmm. Sure. On a long trip, and by that I mean something that's 3, 4, 5, or 6 days, we're actually on the water maybe from 10 in the morning until 4 or 4:30 in the afternoon. And even within those 6 hours, we will stop for lunch, and maybe we'll stop for lunch at a place where there's also some Indian rock art, and we'll take a short 100-yard hike up to look at that rock art. And our guides are trained and able to interpret that rock art in terms of maybe not so much what it means, because we don't know that, but why is it there? What were the people like that painted the pictures? What was their life like in the canyon 2,000 years ago? Other places might be at an old pioneer homestead. In Hell's Canyon in particular, there's lots of those from turn of the century pioneers who came there under the Homestead Act and settled. So the historic element is one thing. In camp, there's a wide variety of activities. A lot of people love to fish, and will go fishing both during the day from the rafts as well as at camp. Other people will nestle up under a shade tree with a book. Some people will build sand castles, play frisbee. We take along games like volleyball and croquet and horseshoes, and there's that. A big part of a river trip is the social element, and certainly as a guide, that's one of the most rewarding parts of it, is meeting people from all over the country and being able to share with them this wonderful place called Idaho and the river canyons. And within the dynamics of the trip, there's always new friends made and new bonds formed in families, and so that's a big part of it as well, just being able to sit down and have quality conversation.
And ecologically, I take it you leave no footprints.
We leave. It's hard not to leave footprints, but we don't leave anything else. We take everything out with us, including human waste. We take portable toilets. We take all the ashes from our fires out because those are contained in fire pans. We take, of course, all of our garbage out. The old days of dig a hole and bury it are over. River corridors, as most wilderness areas, are used enough now that everybody needs to be carrying everything out.
And
I'm sorry, we're out of sorry, we'll have to let that one go. I have a signal from our staff that we're out of time. On behalf of Janelle and our staff, Peter Grubb, thank you for being with us these 2 weeks. It's been most enjoyable to have more information about your exciting adventures in whitewater rafting. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you've enjoyed these 2 programs, and I'd like to invite you to be with us again next week at this very same time, when we will discuss what we believe to be a significant issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.